Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. We always love diving into listener requests, and this one's been popping up a lot. Megaopolies.
Yeah, they're kind of hard to ignore these days, aren't they?
Right, so we've got a stack of research papers and articles here all about megaopolies. And by the end of this deep dive, hopefully we'll all have a clearer picture of what they are, how they work, their impact on the world.
Yeah, I think it's especially important to understand how they're influencing things both globally and like right here in our own communities.
Exactly. So this first paper, defining megaopolies, it actually makes this really interesting distinction between megaopolies and your classic monopolies. Like
Mhm.
we tend to think of monopolies as controlling one specific industry, right? But megaopolies, they're these multinational giants, and they're not limited to just one sector. It's markets, it's politics, it's even culture.
It's almost like they're reshaping the whole playing field, the rules of the game.
Yeah.
It's definitely not just about market dominance anymore.
Okay, yeah, that's a little bit unsettling when you put it like that. The paper uses this phrase, disproportionate power. What are the potential consequences of that?
So think about it. When you have just a handful of companies holding that much power, it can create some serious imbalances. This source actually breaks it down into four main characteristics of megaopolies: economic dominance, political influence, their impact on culture, and geographical concentration.
Yeah.
And each one of these has a whole bunch of implications, some good, some not so good.
Okay, well, let's unpack those a little bit. So, first up, economic dominance. I mean, I think we can all kind of picture what that looks like, but can you give us like a real world example?
Oh, absolutely. Think about Amazon. It started as just an online bookstore, and now it's this massive force selling everything you could possibly imagine. They've got leverage over suppliers, they influence prices, even consumer behavior.
Totally. It's hard to imagine life without Amazon these days, which is kind of the point, right? But that kind of power, doesn't that raise concerns about monopolies and stifling competition?
Oh, for sure. And that's where the whole debate about antitrust laws comes in. Regulators are constantly trying to figure out how these laws, which were, designed for a different time, how they apply to these modern megapolies. It's a really complex battle with high stakes.
So it's almost like megapolies are challenging the very systems that were put in place to regulate them. What about their political influence? I mean, are companies actually writing laws now?
Well, not directly, but they definitely have a big say in shaping policies.
Mm.
Think about it: lobbying efforts, campaign contributions, strategic partnerships with governments. They're using all of these tools to make sure regulations work in their favor.
So it's more of a behind the scenes kind of power, but still incredibly powerful. Can you give us a specific example of how a megapoly has actually shaped public policy?
Well, Google's a good example here.
Yeah.
They're lobbying around data protection laws, like the GDPR and the CCPA, has been pretty widely discussed. They've put a lot of resources into shaping those regulations, often pushing for, let's say, weaker privacy protections that benefit their data-driven business model.
It's almost like this tug of war between corporate interests and individual rights. It makes you think about the ethics of all this lobbying and campaign financing, right?
Yeah, it's a really important debate. How do we balance the interests of these corporations with protecting democracy
Right.
and individual rights? And it's something we need to figure out, especially as megapolies become even more powerful.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider. Okay, so what about their impact on culture? I mean, social media is a big one here, right?
Absolutely. Platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, they're so deeply ingrained in our lives now. It's not just how we communicate or consume information, it's shaping how we see ourselves, how we see the world.
Right. Social media has this huge power to shape culture and social norms. But it's not just about connecting with friends and family anymore. It's algorithms, targeted advertising, even potential manipulation.
Exactly. And megapolies like Meta, which is Facebook's parent company, they're using all this data to personalize our online experience, which can be good, but also,
Yeah, a little bit creepy too, right?
right, it can be convenient, but it also raises questions about filter bubbles, echo chambers, and whether we're losing the ability to think critically.
It's almost like we're letting algorithms make decisions for us. So convenient, but yeah, it makes us vulnerable. The cultural influence of megaopolies, that's a whole other deep dive. Okay, let's talk about geographical concentration. The paper mentions places like Silicon Valley, New York, London. It's like megaopolies have their favorite spots on the map, right?
Well, yeah, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
These global cities offer things like access to capital, a big pool of skilled labor, and often a regulatory environment that's pretty friendly to big businesses.
Hmm.
So it's this kind of cycle where megaopolies thrive in these urban hubs, and that just increases their power and influence even more.
So it's not just about where they're based, it's about how they use those locations to their advantage. New York, for example, with all its financial giants like JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs.
Exactly. New York's become a magnet for financial megaopolies, and that's attracting even more companies like Amazon, who just established a major presence there to tap into all those resources.
And then there's Silicon Valley, the heart of the tech world. It's pulling talent from these top universities, driving innovation in AI, software development.
Silicon Valley is a perfect example of what this source calls an economic cluster. You've got these tech giants, and all around them, this network of startups, venture capitalists, research institutions, it's all interconnected, fueling growth and innovation. But it also creates its own set of issues.
Issues like,
Well, the cost of living there has just gone through the roof. It's almost impossible for anyone who isn't making a tech salary to live there anymore. And that leads to concerns about displacement, gentrification, losing the diversity of the region.
right, so the benefits of this economic cluster, they aren't shared equally. You've got winners, you've got losers, and it brings us back to that idea of disproportionate power we were talking about earlier. It seems like that's a theme with megaopolies, that imbalance.
Yeah, you're right. And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating and so important to understand. They're changing the world in big ways. And we need to be aware of what that means, both the good and the bad.
Absolutely. The source also talks about how these megaopolies, they tend to cluster together, creating these interconnected ecosystems. I'm really intrigued by this economic cluster idea. Can you explain a little more about how that works in practice?
Think of it as kind of a symbiotic relationship. Megaopolies in these global cities, they become interdependent, relying on each other. Suppliers, services, collaborations, they're sharing the same pool of skilled workers, benefiting from the same infrastructure, and a lot of times they're lobbying together for policies that work for them. It's this cycle of growth and mutual benefit, at least for those who are part of the cluster.
It's starting to sound a little bit like an exclusive club. Are these economic clusters ultimately a good thing or a bad thing?
It's not that straightforward. Like most things, it's got pros and cons. On one hand, you've got innovation, job creation, economic growth. On the other, you can have increased inequality, competition gets stifled, power gets concentrated in the hands of a select few.
So there's a trade-off. And we need to be aware of both sides, right? Make sure these economic clusters benefit society as a whole, not just the select few who are part of the club.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, and that takes careful thought, regulation, and constant dialogue.
Okay, so we've talked about how megaopolies aren't just about where they're located, it's their global reach. Which brings us to globalization. This paper actually has a whole section called The Globalization of Corporate Power.
Yeah, that's a huge part of this puzzle. Globalization basically created the perfect environment for megaopolies to thrive. They could expand across borders, access new markets, build these complex supply chains that spanned continents.
Right, it's like globalization gave them this bigger playing field and they know how to play it. But what does that mean for the rest of us? How does this globalization of corporate power actually affect our daily lives?
Think about the things you use every day. Your phone, your clothes, your food. Chances are, all of that was produced through a global supply chain that involves tons of different countries and workers. And megaopolies are the ones orchestrating these networks. They source materials, manufacture goods, distribute them all over the world.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that gives them a ton of power and influence. Can you give us like a concrete example of this in action?
Sure, look at Apple. They design their iPhones in California, but the parts come from all over the world, and the final assembly mostly happens in China. It's this global operation, super efficient, super profitable. But it also raises questions about things like labor practices, environmental sustainability, how wealth gets distributed.
Right. It's easy to forget there are actual people behind these global supply chains. It's not just products moving around. It's about the impact on workers, communities, the environment.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to think about the ethics of globalization. These megaopolies are operating in a system that often prioritizes profit over people and the planet. And we need to figure out how to make sure globalization benefits everyone, not just the corporations at the top.
Okay, I'm really interested in these terms the paper uses. spatial concentration, and network expansion. Can you break those down for us?
So spatial concentration, that's basically the clustering we talked about before, those global cities, the corporate hubs where megapolies tend to gather. Network expansion is how they extend their reach beyond those hubs, creating this web of influence that goes all over the world.
So it's like they establish this strong base in these key locations, and then they leverage that to expand their operations and their influence outward. It's a pretty strategic approach.
Very strategic. And they use all kinds of tactics to do it.
Like what?
Well, the source talks about three main strategies. Building those global supply chains, which we've already talked about, expanding their influence through what's called foreign direct investment, or FDI, and setting up shop in emerging markets.
Okay, let's go through those one by one, maybe with some real-world examples to illustrate. We've already touched on global supply chains, so tell me about FDI. How does that work?
Think about Amazon's network of warehouses. They invest a lot in infrastructure in countries all over the world, bringing their operations closer to customers, making their logistics smoother. That's FDI. Another example is Microsoft's data centers. They put those in strategic locations worldwide to handle the growing demand for cloud computing.
Got it. So strategically placing assets where they'll have the most impact. What about setting up those operational bases in emerging markets?
That's all about tapping into new growth opportunities. Tesla, for example, they built these gigafactories in China and Germany, giving them a foothold in major markets and making them less dependent on one manufacturing location. They can tailor products to local needs, deal with trade barriers, and really establish a global presence.
That makes sense. It's like planting seeds all over the world, each one with the potential to grow into its own little empire. What are some other examples of companies doing this?
Well, Uber is a prime example. They've pushed into markets like India and Brazil, really disrupted things, and quickly gained a global presence. Their strategy is to adapt their platform to local needs, figure out the regulations, and often they use aggressive pricing to capture market share.
Sounds like a pretty risky move, but with huge potential rewards. It's a high-stakes game, and it's playing out on a global level.
Absolutely. And it's not just about economics. It's about shaping markets, influencing consumer behavior, and often challenging the existing power structures.
Okay, so we've established that megaopolies are masters of global expansion. But the source also mentions their influence on specific cities. They list quite a few: New York, London, San Francisco, even Washington, D.C., Brussels, Seattle, each one highlighting a different way megaopolies exert their influence. What are some of the most striking examples for you?
Well, London's a really interesting case. It's this global financial hub, so naturally it attracts those financial megapolies like Goldman Sachs and HSBC, but it's also got a strong creative and tech sector, which draws in companies like Google and Facebook, who want to be close to all that talent and that cultural energy. So you get this unique blend of influence where financial power meets cultural and technological innovation.
It's like this melting pot of megaopoly power, each one using the city's strengths to their own advantage. What about a city like Washington, D.C.? It's not really a financial hub or a tech center.
Right, but Washington, D.C. is the heart of political power in the U.S. So it's no surprise that megaopolies like Google, Amazon, Facebook have a huge lobbying presence there. They're putting a lot of resources into shaping policies, regulations, the whole political landscape to make sure things go their way.
It's like they're playing this multidimensional chess game, using different strategies in different cities to reach their goals. It's not just about today's profits. It's about writing the rules for tomorrow, ensuring their dominance for the long haul.
You got it. It's a strategic approach to global domination, and it's happening in cities all over the world.
Okay, I think we've done a pretty good job of understanding the global reach of megaopolies and their tactics for expansion. But what about the human side of all this? We talked about their impact on workers in global supply chains, but what about their impact on us? On our lives as consumers, as citizens, as members of a society that's increasingly shaped by their presence?
That's the key question, and one that we'll dig into more deeply in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, can't wait. Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, we were kind of mapping out just how massive the reach of these megaopolies really is. But it's not just about, like, economics and globalization. It's about their impact on our everyday lives, as individuals and within our communities.
Yeah, I mean, they're everywhere you look these days.
Right.
Whether it's the apps we're using, the news we're reading, even the jobs we have. It's hard to escape the influence of megaopolies on modern society.
For sure. And sometimes that impact feels really, really personal. You mentioned Seattle, how it's been transformed by Amazon's growth. What happens when a megaopoly becomes so deeply ingrained in a city like that?
Well, Seattle's a good example of what can happen when a company basically becomes part of a city's identity.
Yeah.
All those high-paying tech jobs, they definitely boosted the local economy. But you also have things like housing costs going through the roof, longtime residents getting pushed out, and even the character of the community starts to change. And we're seeing this in other places too, like San Francisco, Austin.
Yeah, it's like a double-edged sword. Economic growth and jobs on one side, but then displacement, inequality, maybe even losing some of that local flavor on the other.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that a megaopoly's impact on a city isn't just one thing. There are winners and losers, and the benefits, they don't always reach everyone.
This reminds me of that idea of economic clusters from the source material. You talked about it as this symbiotic relationship between megaopolis and the cities they're in. Can you explain a bit more about the potential downsides of this interdependence?
Sure. So economic clusters, they can be great for driving innovation and growth, but they can also lead to this dangerous concentration of power. Megaopolies, with all their resources and influence, they can put a lot of pressure on local governments. They can influence policies, regulations, and sometimes that ends up benefiting them, but not necessarily the community as a whole.
So it's almost like they become too big to ignore, too powerful to challenge. And that raises some concerns about, democratic processes and local control, right?
Absolutely. Cities need to find that balance. Welcoming the economic benefit, sure, but also protecting the interests of their residents, making sure they don't lose what makes them unique.
It's complicated, no easy answers. Each city has to figure out its own way to navigate this new landscape. But what about the bigger picture? The social and political impact of megaopolis on society as a whole. This source suggests that they're really changing the fabric of society in some pretty fundamental ways.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. We've already talked about how they influence culture through social media, but it goes even deeper than that. They're changing how we work, how we shop, how we get information, even how we think.
That's a big claim. Can you give us some concrete examples of how megaopolis are reshaping these basic aspects of our lives?
Okay, let's start with work. The rise of the gig economy, driven by companies like Uber and DoorDash, that's a prime example. Millions of people are working as independent contractors now, often without the benefits and protections that come with traditional employment.
Right. And we talked earlier about Proposition 22 in California. That's a perfect illustration of how megaopolis can use their political power to change labor laws to benefit them, even if it means, undermining workers' rights.
Exactly. And it's not just gig work. Megaopolis are using automation, AI, to streamline their operations, which often leads to job losses and widening the gap between the rich and the poor.
So they're not just changing how we work, but who gets to work and on what terms. It's a massive shift in the labor market with huge consequences.
Definitely. And then there's their impact on how we shop. Megaopolis like Amazon, they've created these super convenient, super efficient shopping experiences. But they've also kind of normalized this culture of instant gratification and just constant consumption.
Oh, I'm totally guilty of that. It's so easy to order something online and have it delivered the next day, but I don't always stop to think about the environmental cost of all those deliveries or, whether I'm supporting a company with questionable labor practices.
That's the tricky part. Megaopolis are really good at marketing and persuasion. They make it so easy to participate in this system without questioning the consequences. And all the while, they're collecting data on our shopping habits, our preferences, even our emotions. They use that information to refine their strategies and shape our behavior even more.
It's a little unnerving to think about how much they know about us and how they're using that to influence our choices. What about their influence on how we access information? You touched on that earlier.
Well, think about the role Google and Facebook play in our lives. They control the platforms where we get our news, connect with people, even form opinions. Their algorithms decide what we see, what we read, what we believe.
It's almost like they're curating our reality, filtering the world through their own lens. It makes you worry about bias, misinformation, losing our ability to think for ourselves.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. And it's not just about what they choose to show us. It's also about how they collect and use our data. We talked about privacy, but it goes beyond that. They're building these incredibly detailed profiles on each of us, using that to target us with ads, personalize things, even predict what we're going to do.
It's like they're creating a digital twin of each of us, this data-driven version of who we are and what we do. It's both fascinating and kind of creepy.
I agree. And it makes you wonder what it means to be human in a world where so much of our lives is controlled by algorithms and AI.
Right, like we're outsourcing our decision-making, our identities, even our values to these powerful entities. It's a lot to process.
It is. But I think it's really important that we have these conversations, that we grapple with these questions, and that we find ways to reclaim our agency in this increasingly complex world.
I agree. We can't just passively accept this new reality. We need to be informed, engaged citizens who are willing to question things and demand a better future. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The global and local impacts of megaopolies, their influence on society, their impact on our own lives. But we haven't really talked about solutions. Is there anything we can do to counterbalance their power to make sure they're working for everyone's benefit, not just their own profits?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that we're going to dive into in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready for those solutions. Stay with us, everyone. All right, we're back. And the big question on the table is, what can we actually do about this rise of megaopolies? It's easy to feel kind of powerless, up against these massive corporations, but hopefully you can give us some ideas, some solutions.
It's a valid feeling for sure. They do hold a lot of power, but they're not operating in a vacuum. There are ways to hold them accountable, to shape how things develop, even if it doesn't always feel like it.
Okay, so what are those ways? The research we've been looking at, it hints at a few different scenarios for the future of megaopolies. Some are kind of scary, like the idea that they'll just keep growing unchecked. But it also points to some potential counterbalances. Where do we even begin?
Well, one lever we have is government regulation. We've seen some movement on that front, especially in the EU, with those antitrust lawsuits and attempts to put some limits on the power of big tech.
Right. Those headlines about fines and investigations, it shows that even these giant companies aren't above the law. But is it enough? Some people say those efforts are too little, too late.
I get that skepticism. Megaopolies are really good at finding loopholes and influencing policy. But I don't think we should underestimate the power of strong regulation, especially when governments work together.
So international cooperation is key.
Absolutely. They operate globally, so
Right.
tackling that power requires a coordinated global effort. We need clear, consistent regulations that protect consumers, workers, the environment, no matter where a company is based or doing business.
Makes sense. But what about us, the consumers? Can our choices really make a difference against these huge corporations?
I think so in a few ways. First, we can be more conscious about where we spend our money, supporting businesses that reflect our values. That might mean choosing smaller, local businesses or companies that are committed to ethical practices and sustainability.
Right. Voting with our wallets, making sure our purchases align with what we believe in. What else can we do?
We can use our voices, speaking out against practices we disagree with, supporting boycotts, demanding better from the companies we do business with. All of that puts pressure on them to change.
So being informed, engaged consumers, and using our collective power to hold them accountable, making them realize that their success in the long run depends on earning and keeping our trust.
Exactly. And social media can be a powerful tool for amplifying those messages. These companies care about their image. Negative publicity, online campaigns that can hurt their brand and give them a real incentive to change their ways.
Hitting them where it hurts, their reputation and their bottom line. Okay, so we've got governments, regulators, consumers. What about those disruptive forces you mentioned before? The technologies or business models that could really shake things up.
This is where things get really interesting. We're seeing the emergence of things like decentralized platforms, blockchain technologies, alternative economic models that challenge that centralized power of megaopolies.
Can you give us some examples?
Think about cryptocurrencies, decentralized finance. These technologies could create financial systems that are more transparent, equitable, accessible, and they could bypass those traditional institutions, including the ones controlled by megaopolies.
So it's about shifting power away from those big institutions, putting it back in the hands of individuals. That's a pretty radical idea.
It is in its early days. But these technologies are developing fast, and they could really disrupt things, empower people, and create new ways of organizing ourselves economically and socially.
It's exciting to imagine the possibilities, even if there are definitely risks and uncertainties. What about those alternative business models you talked about?
We're seeing more interest in cooperatives, worker-owned businesses, social enterprises. These are models that prioritize social and environmental impact, not just profit. It's a different way of thinking about business, one that's more in line with what people and the planet need.
So redefining what success means, moving away from just pure profit towards something that values sustainability, equity, community well-being, creating a more humane and just system.
Exactly. And these models are gaining traction. Consumers are demanding more ethical and sustainable practices, and even investors are recognizing the value of businesses that consider those things.
It's encouraging to see that shift happening. It gives me hope that megaopolies won't be the only option in the future.
I agree. It's not about demonizing them. It's about recognizing that we need balance, we need counterforces to make sure they operate in a way that benefits everyone.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. We've explored the rise of megaopolies, the challenges they bring, and some potential ways to create a future that's more equitable and sustainable.
It's been great discussing this important topic with you.
And to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to take action. Remember, even small actions, when enough people take them, can create real change. Until next time, stay curious.